Welcome to Day 3 of Young Writers Week. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion of non-standard storytelling by talking about role-playing games. Now you might be wondering why we're talking about games again. Didn't we already cover this? And although it's true that video games and role-playing games are very similar in the way that they tell stories, in fact, in both of them, interactivity is one of the primary elements in their storytelling, role-playing games offer a certain amount of improvisation and personalized storytelling that can't be replicated in almost any other medium. Now, when I refer to role-playing games here, I'm referring specifically to tabletop role-playing games, things like Dungeons & Dragons, where a group of players representing characters play in a world created by a dungeon master or a host. Now, when many of you think of Dungeons & Dragons, you'll think immediately of a bunch of ragtag adventurers exploring a dungeon, trying to kill monsters and find loot.
Gallstaff, you have entered the door to the north. You are now by yourself, standing in a dark room. The pungent stench of mildew emanates from the wet dungeon walls.
Where are the Cheetos?
But when taken on a broader scale, Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop role-playing systems are, in essence, an act of group storytelling, where a bunch of people get together to imagine a new world where things are happening, and they create a conversation about what actually happens in this world. And all of the rules of the game and all of the dice that are rolled are simply ways to negotiate what happens in a room full of people who disagree about what should happen. So in essence, when talking about role-playing games, there are two essential ways that they can tell stories. The first and most obvious way that these games tell stories is in the way that the players interact with the world that is created by the dungeon master or DM or host. Because each session, in a nutshell, is about the characters that the players have created overcoming trials and quests that have been designed and are officiated by the host. The second way that role-playing games can tell stories is in the system itself. This goes beyond the lore, the setting, and the characters that you create in order to make your system seem appealing, but rather also includes the system, the dice, how conflict is resolved, and the way that characters can grow and interact with the world. Now, the second bit is something I won't be able to get into today, but if it's something you'd like to see, let me know and I'll make a video about it in the future. Now back to the first case. So for those of you unfamiliar with Dungeons & Dragons or other role-playing systems, I'm going to do a brief breakdown of how they operate from a storytelling perspective. So sometime before the first game even begins, the host creates the universe that the players will interact with. This is very similar, if not completely identical, to the way that writers create the universe for the novels that they're writing. This includes things like backstories, places, characters, things that have happened, important historical events, everything that you might need to know about a world in order to understand how it functions and what might be of interest inside of it. The DM will often have a distant objective or overarching quest for the players to accomplish, and as a result, the plot that they plan for the game often follows that of the quest narrative. If you want to know more about that, check out this link to my talking about the basic plot. And so shortly before the session, the DM will create a rough outline of certain events or situations that the players might be able to encounter during their play. In the meantime, the players have all created their characters. They've talked with the DM about the limitations of the world and how their character fits into that world. They plan out their characters' histories, how they feel about important topics, and what kind of overarching goal they want to accomplish in life. And then, when the DM and characters meet, the DM introduces the world and the players introduce their characters, and they begin exploring this world together. What's important to note for our purposes is that everything in the universe is under the Dungeon Master's direct control, except for the decisions of the players. The player gets to decide what their character feels, how they think, and what they act upon. And so all of the rules in the game determine how the players are able to interact with the world created by the DM in order to create outcomes. And so storytelling in role-playing games revolves not just around the world that the DM has created, not just around the characters that the players have created, but rather the way that those two things interact, as both of them are used by their creators to try and tell their own stories and try to accomplish specific goals inside of this game. Both the DM and the players are trying to create the best outcome for themselves and for the thing that they've created. And so now that you know basically how they operate, we can move on to a deeper analysis. So first, what are the limitations here? The biggest hurdle to telling stories through role-playing games is in the improvisational nature of the medium. The DM can never accurately predict what the players are going to do in a particular situation, so planning a story more than one step ahead is difficult, if not impossible. Every story that you tell has to be both flexible and modular enough to continue, even when the players don't know how to continue the story or make a decision that you didn't think was logical or even possible. After all, you can plan out the most intense and gripping chain of events, a serious and tragic tale of epic proportions. But if the players decide to walk away from it halfway through or make a decision that completely undermines the plan that you had, you have to accommodate that for your story, and that will change the way that it progresses. And so when planning out stories for role-playing games, you have to constantly be aware that the players will often make decisions that you didn't want them to make. And although it might seem like a good idea to tell a story wherein the player's choices can't influence the narrative and it continues regardless of the decisions made. This can often backfire because the most important aspect of role-playing games is the fact that the players have agency. They have characters that can make decisions and make choices. The worst thing you can do is create a story where the players feel like their actions have no consequences. Because the entire point of role-playing games is to give players the capacity to change this world that you've created. And that happens to be one of its greatest strengths. The second hurdle to telling stories is that each role-playing system is tailored to a general setting. For example, Dungeons & Dragons and systems like Rolemaster are primarily intended for fantasy stories, whereas other systems like Savage Worlds work for sci-fi settings, and things like Call of Cthulhu exist in this weird in-between. I don't have time to get into specifically why this is the case, but it is essentially because the systems and the rules of the game rely on a bunch of tropes and assumptions that are specific to these genres in order for them to function as a rule system. Although it is possible to take one of these games and take it out of its intended setting into another one, it often has adverse side effects that are difficult to predict and even harder to overcome. This represents an issue because each role-playing system takes a lot of time and reading and experience playing in order to understand, and it's impractical to expect someone to be familiar with more than a couple role-playing systems at a time. And so you often have to tailor your stories to the role-playing system that you're playing rather than being able to pick a role-playing system that matches the story you want to tell, because you can't rely on people that you know being familiar with that system. The final limitation to role-playing systems is that people are weird. Role-playing games can attract all sorts of people to them, and each of your games has to be tailor-made to the people you intend to be playing them. Each player has their own expectations for what they want out of play, and they may not agree with you or they may not agree with each other. And so it can sometimes be difficult to tell a story that will appeal to everyone in your group. So it can be hard to tell your story if the players aren't a fan of it, because they always have the power to simply ignore whatever it is you're trying to do and do something else. And so even if you do end up telling a story, it may not be the one you wanted, and it can be very difficult to improvise a story just because someone decided to do something completely unrelated to what you planned. Now, that was a lot of limitations, but there are just as many advantages. The first advantage is that role-playing games are stories told to an extremely small audience. It is one DM to a handful of players, rarely more than 5. This means that you can be extremely responsive to the demands of your audience. If your players like particular story elements or want to see a particular thing happen, you can change your story to make that happen. If one of your story hooks doesn't seem to be grabbing your audiences, or there's a character that they don't really like, you can shuffle them to the side and make them disappear. If the players become obsessed with a small detail you threw in just for flavor, like coming across a stray dog that they decide to adopt, you can change your story immediately to adapt to this circumstance and make their small obsessions a major part of the story. Because the stories that you tell during a role-playing game evolve every time that they are conjured. Every time that the players interact with the world, you have new things that you know that they're invested in, and you can change the story to be filled with all of the things that your players care about, that they want to see brought to development in the world. So story elements never have to be left unresolved. If the players are really concerned about a character that they met 5 hours ago but haven't heard from since, they can go on a quest to find out what's happening to them right now. And then you, on the spot, get to improvise what happened to this character you forgot about. The second advantage is that most role-playing games come with things like lore books, lists of characters, organizations, creatures, maps, descriptions of cities and countries. These are all things that take writers a month to prepare when they're trying to tell a story, but you have access to at your fingertips. And this allows you to tell much more in-depth or involved narratives with much less effort than it would take to make it up all on the spot. This essentially means that you can start imagining and telling a story much quicker than you would be able to than if you had to start from scratch. This is especially helpful if you want more practice telling stories, because taking a universe that's already been created, figuring out a story that you can tell through it, and then telling it to a group of people, mostly your friends, is extraordinary practice for learning how to tell stories, how to create compelling characters, and how players or characters or people will act in very specific circumstances. And this brings us to a third benefit. People are weird. Your players will do things that you did not expect. They will ask about things that you did not even consider. And this forces you to constantly think about the world that you're in and think about how these questions would relate to your story. If someone asks you why that torch is lit, you have to wonder, why is that torch lit? That's a terrible example. I should really have picked something better. If one of the players asks you who the mayor of this town is, you now have to think who the mayor of this town is, why they were elected, what they stood for, and what kind of decisions they're making for the town in general. This can give you a deeper understanding of how stories operate on a functional level, because it gives you appreciation for the minutiae, how small details and small elements can be crucial for a person's understanding of what's going on. And of course, it's all improvised. You're not expected or supposed to have everything planned out. You're supposed to be thinking on the fly. And so you get this advantage of the players helping you tell your story. Now, how is it that you can start telling stories through role-playing games? Now, unfortunately, it takes a lot of experience with the role-playing system in order to be a dungeon master. And role-playing systems are incredibly complex. They involve a lot of counting, charts, understanding of processes, and learning a system will feel a lot like studying sometimes. And on top of that, you need an extraordinary amount of confidence in your knowledge of the system and how it can function, the possibilities inherent in it, and how you can play with the rules in order to accomplish a specific outcome. And so you'll likely need a lot of experience as a player before you can start DMing, and a lot of experience as a DM before you can start developing your own stories through it. And reading textbooks over and over again isn't going to be enough to give you that confidence, because you need enough practical experience playing it to understand how sessions operate. And unless you know a group of people that already play a role-playing system, it can be very difficult to convince a group of your friends to take the effort to learn a system in order to play a game that they've never played before. Because creating characters, learning a system takes an extraordinary amount of time investment. And if you don't find that engaging in and of itself, it can be difficult to convince people to do it just so that they can try a thing. Luckily, role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons are experiencing a resurge in popularity, and it's very much possible to find drop-in events or learning events where you can try the game out for the first time with a bunch of people who are also new. And this could be a good way to make sure that it's something that you want to be involved in before taking all of the effort of learning a system, figuring out everything you need to know in order to run it. Because in the end, it is a game. It's meant to be something that you enjoy doing, so you're never going to be able to force someone to play it just to experience your story. They have to enjoy the game itself in order to appreciate the story that you're trying to tell through it. So that's all there is for this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or you would like to see that video about how systems themselves can tell stories, leave a comment below. And remember, Ask an Expert event happening this Saturday between noon and 4 p.m. Today's spotlight is on Natasha Dean, an author who moved to Canada to escape the racial and political violence of Guyana, South America. Her recent books include Lark Holds the Key, Across the Floor, and the award-winning Guardian series. If you have any questions for Natasha Dean, make sure to drop by the Ask an Expert event this Saturday. Join me tomorrow to learn about telling stories through commercials and advertisements. So until then, have a good night and keep on writing. I mean, you don't have to write. I recommend it. Just because.